Cassus grimaced a little as he felt the sting, and then his nose crinkled at the smell of burnt fur, but to his surprise it was over in a few seconds. That's it? He didn't try turning his head to look at the heavy-set human because it wouldn't have done him any good while strapped to the operating table. That's it, the human said before he started to unstrap Cassus. Once the restraints were removed, he sat up on the table, reaching back to tenderly rub his hand along the back of his neck. He could feel a small scar that bisected his fur, but even as he rubbed it, he didn't feel any pain. How is such an operation so painless? He asked as the human stepped around the table. Oh, it's not. The man chuckled and smiled in such a friendly manner Cassus had trouble reminding himself. This was the personal surgeon of that insane, fire-haired demon who commanded the ship. You're on some pretty great painkillers right now. Even then, it's really not that bad like you said. But mostly because I've got lots of experience. Perfection through practice. That's what I say. The human smiled and helped Cassus off the table, not seeming to have any trouble with it. He was quite large for a doctor, but Cassus was having trouble determining the human classes by occupation. They didn't seem to base position on the color of what little hair they had. Their skin color also didn't seem to change anything. None of the males seemed to take issue with being commanded by females, and perhaps strangest of all the Xenos he'd seen seemed to be integrated into the ship's authority structure, not separate. Perhaps it was his head. The doctor said he was on medication, but I can't be, he said as he rubbed his hands over his legs for a moment. I don't feel inebriated. Yeah, I saw the stuff from your ship. That's barely refined narcotics. Like half a step above holistic medicine garbage. Once I started looking through it, I half expected to find acupuncture needles. Cassus was confused by that comment. Well, they aren't in the med bay. They're in the massage parlor on the noble deck for the prince and his honored guests. The human blinked at that, and then started laughing, which for some reason made Cassus feel bashful. Then again, as he looked around the room he was in now, he was starting to understand that the humans might be ahead of them in some aspects of technology. This medbay was huge, and he saw far more surgeons than he was used to seeing. Not only that, but they had mechanical arms that dropped down from the ceiling, which would apparently assist surgeons or perform basic operations autonomously. Then again, their faith in machines was dangerous. None of the treaty members would give a machine such control after the crusade. But perhaps the humans had a different experience. He'd find out. You use blades and lead spitters, yet you have medical technology beyond anything I've seen from our kingdom or any of the others. He confessed, trying to make some sense out of this new species. Oh, humans are masters of pain, both inflicting it and ignoring it. The mixed beverage of typically alcoholic nature that I gave you was designed to temper what pains are still in your body from the battle without clouding your mind. It seems to have been pretty successful if I do say so myself. The human grinned as Cassus frowned. But I didn't drink anything, he said as he tried to think on when he was made to drink something. Drink? The human looked confused for a moment. Oh, the mixture of medicine I gave you. It was that shot earlier. Translation error? The human shrugged. Tell me, what is your name, surgeon? Cassus finally asked, since he figured he'd need to know his name rather than just refer to him as the heavy-set human doctor. My name is Small Dessert Cake made of stiff sweet dough. Cassus blinked at the human who noticed that look. Hold on. My name is Kooky. Had to add a translator exception for my name. Your name translates to Small Dessert Cake made of stiff sweet dough? Cassus asked, with an arched brow. Well, sort of. It's a naval thing. It's hard to explain with my translator on. You see, that name does mean that, but in our language, the word for chef is similar to this. And it's sometimes used as a term of endearment. So the head chef is often called this. Cassus frowned as this was explained. But, wait, I thought you're a doctor. I am, the human said with a nod. But, I'm also the commander's personal chef, he said with a smile. Once you start cutting up creatures to cook, you get curious about how they work, and sometimes how to put them back together. Really, if your surgeons aren't great chefs, then they're doing something wrong somewhere, the human said with a big grin and a chuckle. He was nothing like the cold professionals he was used to. Did surgeons here not have personal servants to do their cooking? Well, Kooky, how can I understand you right now? Cassis asked as he got to his next set of questions. What do you mean? I have a translator. I only removed yours. The human arched a brow. Cassis found it interesting that they seemed to share this bit of body language. It was overall hard for him to read humans. Their ears didn't twitch, they lacked tails, and their noses seemed to be far less versatile than his muzzle, so when something was the same, it was comforting. Yes, that's what I mean. How can I understand you if I don't have a translator to comprehend what you're saying? As he spoke about it, his hand reached back and tenderly rubbed the scar once more. That's only if your vocal cords aren't capable of making the sounds needed for the other language. Then it just overrides your voice and projects the other language. Well, depending on your settings. Can't you adjust yours? He paused. That is, couldn't you before I removed it? What? Adjust the settings on my own? No, all translators are very carefully set by the Royal Guild of Biometric Technicians. I'm a ship's captain. What would I know about translation devices and proper settings? Really? The human asked as he rubbed his chin. Interesting. I'll have to take a look at the device and see how different it is. It seems incredibly inconvenient to not be able to adjust it on the go. Do you have to have one of those technicians see it every time you meet a new species? Cassis snorted. Of course we do. But until your fleet emerged from the nebula, we hadn't met a new species in several centuries. I suppose it's a good thing you've got some basic language protocols from the Germo. Ah, yes. The hard-shelled amphibians of the void. Very interesting creatures. They claim that they're the only species from this sector that will venture into the nebula. Cassis had heard the humans say Germo before, so he wasn't sure why this time it was different. Either way, he nodded. They are. They've always been looking for new trade routes and don't mind venturing into the nebula. I just wish they'd warned me about you. The human laughed at that. Ah, well, our fleet is faster than their trade fleet, so I'm not sure they had the chance. All right, we should get you back to Andromeda before she wonders what's taking so long. The human tilted his head and Cassis began to follow him. When two statues detached themselves from the walls and stepped behind him, Cassis jumped in surprise, but then realized they were the armored soldiers that made up the pirate baroness's private guard. As his heart settled back down in his chest, he gulped and quickly followed the doctor. Throughout the med bay, he saw his officers being tended to by other human doctors, or the mechanical arms available in each patient room, and he had to admit they were being treated far better than he ever expected. He remembered that the pirates claimed 15,000 of his men had decided to work for them, and was beginning to think that might be possible. It was roughly a third of his crew, and considering the royal decree of conscription wasn't all that favorable to commoners, he could see the appeal. But a third was still a lot in his mind. He began to think about the other prisoners, all those influential children who were his charge and he'd failed. He had protected none of them. Would it have even been possible for him to have done anything else in the battle? Finally, they were out of the med bay and walking through the main halls of the ship. The halls on the human ship unnerved him a little. They were just so plain. No decorations, no brasswork, no reliefs along the top. Just flat functionality. It was depressing in a way. Where were the lovingly crafted displays of skill by their masons and builders? Maybe they were in the officers' personal quarters. Those questions halted as he was led into the smallest throne room he'd ever seen. Small, but still impressive. These paintings are massive, he murmured as he looked around the long room with massive oil paintings that stretched from the very bottom of the room to the top. There was some sort of planetary system, a city amid mountains, and then several paintings of naval battles in the void. He'd never seen paintings this size outside of the Royal Gallery, and to be honest, these looked even more impressive to him. The detail and sense of scale combined with the majesty of the location and the ferocity of the battles was incredible. Do you like them? He looked forward and saw the pirate commander on a very nice chair on a slightly raised platform at the other end of the room. He supposed it was her throne, but it paled in comparison with what he was used to seeing. Around her were the rest of her guard and that strangely dressed advisor. Throne rooms were supposed to evoke a sense of awe and power, but this one felt more like an art gallery with a chair in it. The massive armored guards flanking him, however, provided the sense of power and intimidation that the room itself lacked. "The paintings are incredible indeed," he said as he walked forward and then saw the final painting on the wall behind the pirate. To the left side of the back door was a portrait of a human. He possessed dark hair and dark eyes, with some fur around his mouth that looked different than the humans he'd seen so far. He was wearing a very impressive uniform of black, crimson, and gold, the same colors of the pirate's armor. But what took Cassis's attention the most were the eyes. Even through a painting, he could see the intense intelligence behind them, tempered by anger, sadness. It was hard to tell since he didn't know human faces as well. He saw some familiarity between the painting and the pirate, but he couldn't quite figure out how close they were. "Who's he?" "Victor Suvakov, Admiral of the Navy, the Void Spectre, undefeated in major engagements, and without a doubt the finest human commander of the so-called Unification Wars. Perhaps the finest human commander of the post-Saul era. My father." When she said that, Cassis looked from her to the painting. Their hair was different colors which had thrown him, but now he saw it in the eyes. The difference was her intense intelligence was backed with madness. Undefeated in major engagements? Why would you add that? He asked then, realizing that she'd been specific about that. The pirate shrugged and shifted in her chair, leaning to the side a bit. Because it depends on how you look at it. He was well known for strategic withdrawals that would draw his enemies into larger-scale conflicts. So it's debatable if that should be considered. In every battle that he took offensive action, however, he won. And against numerically superior forces at that. He was well respected by his enemies and loved by his country. She said with obvious pride in her voice. "So is he ashamed because his daughter is a pirate?" Cassis said, and noticed the guards around him take a step closer. For a moment he thought he might have earned a beating, but the pirate laughed, and the guards seemed to ease back. "Hardly," came her reply before pointing to the massive metal box with a single red light on the front that made him uneasily think of an eye. "First of all, that's where he lives these days. Second of all, he's damn proud of me. I've yet to lose a battle of any kind, and he agrees that the best chance for our people is for me to keep with my current plan to seize a system for our own." Cassis frowned as he took in the new information. "Best chance for your people? Pirates?" He glanced at the box in the corner, figuring that her father's ashes or body must be preserved inside. That was a little unnerving, but not unheard of among noble families in some circumstances, while the will was settled. "No, we have a colony fleet as well. Those who don't want to fight live in the civilian fleet. But that's not important right now. The reason I brought you here is to tell me what you think of my little throne room. I figure you've got plenty of experience with such places." She waved her hands at the room around them. Cassis looked around at the paintings for a moment, and then looked back at her, trying to choose his words carefully. "It's quite cozy." He tried, but the pirate just sighed and shook her head. "Be honest, Captain Deveros. I won't punish you for speaking your mind." She leaned forward then, clearly interested in what he'd say. "It's not tall enough," he started with. "Right now it feels like an art gallery with a big chair in it. The throne is just a big chair. This place lacks the awe and sense of importance that good throne rooms possess. That said, the paintings are incredible, like nothing I've ever seen," he said as he looked around. "However, your guards are far more imposing than the royal guard. They're quite fancy-looking and compare well with the guards of other national leaders." He looked around at the pirates' guard in their worn armor, with scratches and dents here and there, and the menacing skulls on the visors. "But yours would mop the floor with the entire royal regiment, I suspect." The pirate grinned wide and giggled at that final comment, and he heard the guards chuckle from inside their armor. So they had translators as well, then. He'd have to remember that. They might not look like much marching in formation, but you're right, they're the best there is in combat. Even so, I agree with your assessment. However, when the ship was built, no throne room was considered. This is simply a repurposed conference hall. Now then, follow. She got up then and started walking out the back of the room, waving for him to follow as she did. Without waiting for the guards to give him a shove, Cassis began to follow. The pirate's advisor fell in just behind her left side, so Cassis took the flanking position on her right. As they walked through the hall, they passed a checkpoint of some sort in the hall where 4 more pirates in armor kept watch. This checkpoint will be the limit of your freedom. All the halls and rooms past here are open to you. What? Cassis said, surprised at the pirate's comment. This whole section is my private suite in the ship. I'll show you around briefly so you get a better sense of the area. If you get lost, just ask the guards, since there's no way out except past this checkpoint. And as I mentioned, you won't be let past it. But I'm your captive, Cassis said, now more confused. That's one way to think of it. I suppose you can just consider this to be a much larger, nicer cell than most prisoners get. Or you can just think of yourself as a guest with a host who's more strict than most. However you like. The woman shrugged and then led him to the first room in this private section of the ship. This is the gym. Inside, he saw a room with mirrors along one wall for some reason, and a strange, spongy-looking material on the ground. Other than that, the weights and machines set up around the place looked suspiciously high-tech. Why would their technician guild waste so much time with maintenance on such machines? Perhaps because this was the private suite of the commander? Maybe. Now over here is the pool, she said, and escorted him to the room across from the gym. Inside was just as she mentioned, a pool. At least the human pool looked normal, though the tiles inside had a rather boring symmetrical system of lines instead of frescoes or murals like he was used to. But he already knew the humans had a very boring sense of style, utilitarian. He didn't like it. The library is just down here. This piqued his interest as they walked down the hall, and he was led into a very long room with comfy-looking leather chairs and a few tables spread around. Other than that, metal bookcases sealed with glass lined every wall, with several more walls added just of bookcases. He did respect the sheer amount of books kept here, though he had no idea what sort of content they'd hold, considering this was a library owned by a pirate. Even so, it was twice as big as the library that had been on the Nivian Rose. That door down there leads to Junko's room. Knock before entering? You mean it's off limits? Right, sir? Junko spoke up, saying the first thing since Cassis had joined up with them again after the med bay. I suppose, the pirate said with a shrug. All right, you need her permission to enter. Anyway, that room is the museum, but it's not finished. A museum? Cassis asked with some surprise. Dedicated to my father. I'm honestly not sure who will visit, but I want to finish it someday. She started to walk past it when Junko spoke up again. Sir, considering the hollow table in there, wouldn't it benefit the captain to give him access so he can better understand human history? You know that's actually a good idea. All right, Captain Devoros. You can enter, but don't touch anything except the hollow table. Understood? As she looked back at Cassis, he nodded quickly. Yes, I understand. All right. Now we're getting to my favorite room. The officer's bar, she said with a grin, and walked into the next room ahead of him. As the door opened, he heard some strange music coming from inside and stepped into the first room with real character he'd seen on the ship. Stretching out in front of him was some sort of bar with wood floors, tables, and chairs. Actually, he noticed the bar was wood as well. It was all a deep reddish-brown held together with dull brass. In the corner was a raised stage with several human musicians playing a style of music he'd never heard before. One was playing a bass while standing up. There was one with some form of trumpet or horn. Another sitting at some sort of wood box, playing with little keys on top and pedals on the bottom. And finally another sitting behind a set of what must be drums. They were playing so quickly, and he didn't notice any sheet music. This was a far cry from the orchestra he was used to. What do you think of the music? How are they playing? I don't see any sheets for them to read as they play, he said, which made the pirate laugh. You've never seen musicians make it up as they go along? What music do you have? Orchestra, Cassis replied, and the pirate waited for a moment before realizing he had nothing else to add. That's it? You're a spacefaring kingdom that's never evolved beyond orchestra? How boring. This is jazz. The last word made him frown as it was distinctly human sound. They had another form of music? Well, he supposed that shouldn't be all too unusual for another species, though. As far as he knew, all the other species also just had orchestra. Jazz, he said, the word sounding a little odd. That's it, the pirate said with a nod. We've also got rock, metal, electronic, alternative. Then she went into a series of words that didn't translate and made him blink in confusion. There was no way a species that still used blades and lead spitters had so many kinds of music. Their ship seemed to be bereft of stone, metal, or woodcrafters. How could they all be musicians? What species would allow their working class to display such a lopsided focus and skills? The chances of becoming a wealthy musician and working up the social structure had to be laughable, while skilled craftsmen were always respected. Most of those didn't translate, he informed her. And you can't be serious. What species has need for that much music? Need? She exclaimed with surprise. It's not need, it's desire. Variety is the spice of life, my good captain. And on this ship I've assembled quite the collection of musicians. Come then, let me show you the final room, my private quarters, so you might better understand our use of music. As she left the bar behind, Cassis was a bit surprised but followed behind her obediently. When they came to a massive room marked with a skull over crossed swords, he couldn't help but notice the dry flakes of the paint looked like blood. But it wasn't blood, right? When she stepped through the doors, he noticed the guards stayed outside, and soon it was just the pirate, the advisor, and himself. Flanking either side of the entryway were massive aquariums that made him stare for a moment at all the vibrant and brightly colored aquatic creatures inside. Then the floor stepped down into an area covered in a creamy off-white carpet. The furniture arrayed around the central area was incredibly mismatched, however. Some leather, some wood, some metal, he wasn't sure. "I'm home, boys!" the pirate called out then, and he heard some sort of thudding and panting before he gasped and turned to run as he saw 3 massive creatures running from the back rooms. They were 4-legged creatures with some sort of spiked fur. No, those were scales. Or were they scales or fur? They looked hard like scales, but moved and swayed differently than he expected. And as they ran up to the pirate, she would pet and scratch their heads, which would make the scales ripple down the length of their bodies like swaying grass or waves. They were quite strange, and he especially noticed their massive fangs as they rubbed up against the pirate. Those are pets?" he gasped out, as he tried to figure out what they might be. She found them shortly after their mother was killed, and she raised them herself. "That's all I can tell you," Junko informed him. Then the creatures pressed past the pirate, and one began to headbutt Junko's legs, nearly knocking the girl over as she reached down to rub the creature's cheek. When the nearest one to Cassis that had grayish scales with some sort of blue undertone or glow sniffed at him, he gulped and whimpered a bit. But then the creature looked back at the pirate. She said something in the human language, and then the creature began to nuzzle against Cassis's side. "Nice, boy," Cassis murmured and reached down to pet the creature's head, rubbing back its ears, which it seemed to like. As he touched the creature, he had even more trouble figuring out what coated it, since it felt more like a stone covered in moss than anything else he could describe. But finally, the pirate waved the creatures past Cassis and out the door. "Kooky, go feed them," she told the heavy-set doctor, chef, who nodded and happily started rubbing and petting the happy-seeming creatures. "All right, let me get you more familiar with human music," the pirate said, walking forward to some sort of wood and black mesh table. She picked up a sleeve of some sort and pulled out a black disc, which she set into some sort of glass case with a machine inside. His ears twitched back as he heard a sudden pop sound, but then he began to hear music. It was a soft orchestral piece like he was used to. The method it was being played, however, was not. "What? That's a music playback device?" he asked, and walked forward next to the pirate to observe the process. Inside, a small round spot spun around, dragging a needle across the surface of the disc. Though he had no idea how that made music. Was it reading it like a hard disk drive? Was this some incredibly simple version of old computer tech? "It's ancient even to humans," she admitted. "I robbed a ship belonging to an eccentric rich asshole who had the galaxy's largest collection of such things. His kids were on the yacht as well. He didn't want to pay up at first, so I sent him a little recording on one of these. After that, he paid everything I wanted." Cassis's blood ran cold as she said that. The detached way she spoke about it. Her seemingly normal conversation and behavior so far had made him forget that she was responsible for the deaths of thousands of his men and several ships. "Ah, this is classical," she huffed, annoyed with the black disc. "Junko! You know I don't play music without your express permission, sir." Cassis had to assume they simply hadn't turned off their translators for his sake. All right, but I've got my eyes on you. The pirate pointed 2 fingers into her eyes and then turned them to point at Junko. She opened the case and tossed the disc behind her as Junko quickly caught it. Then the pirate pulled another disc from another sleeve and set it back down. Once the music started, he heard brief portion with orchestra music, and then suddenly the tempo changed drastically. It became upbeat, and then he started hearing strange scratches and sounds that sounded more electronic. A human began singing, a female with a very nice voice, even if he didn't understand what was being said. The pirate turned then and suddenly grabbed Cassis, pulling him close. She set one hand on his hip and took the other in her armored fingers. She began to move her hips side to side to the beat of the music while taking small steps back and forth. When he looked up at her face, she was smiling wide. "Come on, Cassis, move your feet! It's time to dance." He hesitantly set his free hand on her hip and began to move his feet like she was trying to copy her movements. But just as he thought he was getting the hang of it, she used his lifted hand to spin him around and then start dancing while pressed up against his back, holding his arm at an awkward angle until he realized how to shift and turn it a bit. The way she pressed up against him from behind, one hand settled on his hip. It wasn't the worst experience. And the music was quite nice. He actually started moving with more enthusiasm through the dance, letting the power-armored human take the lead. He'd never had a female take lead in a dance, but he'd never danced with a human at all. Maybe this was normal? As the song stopped and moved on to another cheerful little tune, the pirate let go and smiled. "How's that for human music?" "Well, it's actually quite nice. I never would have thought that a pirate might—" He trailed off as he began to think about what he was saying. The pirate, of course, noticed, and a slow smirk crept over her face. "What? You never thought a pirate might enjoy such nice music? Why, my dear Cassis, the only difference between a hero and a villain is the soundtrack, and I make sure to have a wonderful soundtrack." She laughed as he frowned. "You can't be serious. Music is not what determines a hero from a villain," he protested. "Oh? So why am I so bad? You murder people!" he exclaimed, but the pirate didn't seem fazed. "Do I murder them? Or kill them?" Cassis frowned as he tried to figure out the difference. There is no difference." "Well, does that mean you're also a murderer? You're a ship's captain. Have you not gone to war?" Cassis opened and closed his mouth a few times before finally speaking. "It's different." The pirate just laughed at his words and poked him in the chest, which made him stagger back due to her armor-enhanced strength. "How? Because you serve a king who tells you that you're now going to war? I was once an officer in a navy. Didn't you wonder about my father? He was an admiral, and this was his ship. Did you think pirates built this ship? The only difference between us now is that you have a home and I don't." Cassis blinked at her words. "But that—" He tried to collect his thoughts. "You attacked civilian vessels! You said you raided a yacht belonging to some rich human and stole his music. Clearly you don't just target military vessels. So when you go to war, you just let all your enemy's merchant vessels through? You don't try to raid their shipping or blockade strategic systems?" she countered as Cassis tried to think of a reason that was different. Finally, he pointed at her. "You're ransoming off the prisoners you captured on my vessel and threatened to eject 5,000 sailors into the void." He nodded then and crossed his arms, but she smiled, which made him nervous. "I did," she nodded. "I did do that. But has your nation always treated prisoners perfectly? Is your kingdom's history completely free of the blight of killing enemy prisoners?" Cassis paused. "That doesn't make it okay. Depends on how you justify it. Isn't it? Are there instances where your commanders rationalized their actions after the fact, and it turned out to be beneficial to your war effort?" Cassis quietly thought that over, his silence his only reply. "See, good men can always rationalize their actions. The difference is I don't care." She tapped her chest. "I'm fighting for a home. Nothing will stand between me and that goal. I could rationalize what I've done action by action, or I can simply say fuck it. I'm a villain with a great soundtrack who knows exactly what she wants and won't be stopped by anything. Not by my enemies, not by morals, not by laws, except for the laws of physics that we haven't been able to break yet, of course." Cassis was left standing there feeling more and more confused by the pirate. and rather than continue to argue with him, she just smiled as a new song came on. "Oh, I love this song too." She started to dance and sway to the tune before she started walking deeper into the room, out of the carpeted central area he was standing in. "Now then, Junko, invite that other girl to join us while I get changed." The advisor tapped something on that metal rectangle she held as the pirate vanished into the depths of her private suite. "She's got you all confused, huh?" Junko said once she was done with her typing. "Yes," Cassius had to admit as various thoughts moved through his mind. "Does she really treat her crew well?" "Very. And those who are tired or done fighting are free to join the civilian colony fleet or get dropped off on any planets that are habitable. Though there's something you should know about that recording she said she made of the kids. They weren't tortured." Cassius frowned at that and looked to the advisor human. "She faked it?" he asked, unsure how he felt about the words of the pirate's advisor. There was just something trustworthy about her. "No, they were isolated from the boarding action, so they didn't see the violence. She personally found them and told them that she was there to take them on a special adventure organized by their dad. Part of that adventure included her taking a small shuttle to a local planet, and while disguised, took them to an amusement park. She recorded them screaming while on various rides, or begging her to stop tickling them. She even recorded the noises they made after they ate too many sweets and got sick all over the place. Then she edited it and had the record sent to their father. I'm told he assumed it was torture and broke down, giving in to her demands. But when they were returned unharmed, thinking that he'd arranged for them to have an adventure with their long-lost aunt, he paid double. "Is this true?" he asked, though he had a feeling from the look on her face that it was. "It is. But she's also a violent and bloodthirsty pirate who slaughters her enemies wholesale without remorse." Cassius blinked as she said that, and Junko shifted a little. "I suppose what I'm trying to say is that she's not insane. She just doesn't care about the same things as most people. She has limits, though they're pretty rare, and she's very reasonable about most things. If you become her friend, she will be the best friend you've ever had. And if you become her enemy, she will get her revenge. I don't know what your kingdom is like, but if they don't treat her with the respect she demands, it will not end well. I don't envy your position as we'll start to move through your systems on our way to her goal." Cassius didn't envy himself either. He looked at Junko then. "My niece is one of her prisoners, Neria Hinre Losan. If you can do anything to keep her safe, I'd greatly appreciate it. My family isn't nearly as wealthy as those of the other noble prisoners, and she was only able to join the prince's guest list because she is in fact my niece. She's young and innocent and deserves none of this. I have no idea if I'll ever be able to repay you, but please, can you help me?" Junko was quiet for a while before nodding. "I will. And something you should know, Captain. I might not be a prisoner, but I'm not really free either." She glanced at her metal rectangle then, and walked over to the far side of the room, not down the hall that the pirate went, but over to a small bar. She set the metal rectangle down and poured some sort of amber liquid into 2 large tumblers, and walked them back over. "You're going to want to drink this." He took the offered glass and sniffed at it, eyes watering a little from the smell, and he had to cough a bit to clear his lungs of the vapors. "Is this pure alcohol? No ice, no mixture, nothing?" Then to his shock, the small human woman gulped hers down without stopping. Only when her glass was empty did she take a deep breath. "Trust me, you're going to need it. And Captain, no matter what happens tonight, no matter what either one of us has to do, I want you to know that it's not personal and there's no hard feelings either way." She looked a little worried, and now Cassius was too. He was about to ask more, but then jumped as he heard some sort of sharp crack. "What was that?" he asked, now very worried. "I don't know if there's a word for it in your language, but it's a leather device that can travel at supersonic speeds that's designed to punish and motivate slaves." By her very matter-of-fact way of speaking, he could tell she wasn't joking, but his eyes were wide with confusion and surprise. "What?" he exclaimed, and then saw the pirate step out from the hallway she'd vanished into earlier. "All right. Who's ready for some fun?" His mouth fell open as she was no longer wearing the armor, but something far different. Then he saw the coiled leather object in her hand, and as she suddenly lashed out with it, making that loud crack just above his head, he jumped and then gulped down the drink Junko had given him as quickly as he could, ignoring the fire burning down his throat. He was going to need this drink desperately, that much was certain.